And so many of you have forgotten much about World War II history, but it means so much to America. What does it mean? It really means that we're free, aren't we? Do you know that nobody can go into your home without a warrant? Do you know that you can get in your automobile today and drive throughout the entire United States without any restrictions whatsoever, which you can't do in many countries in the world? Do you know that if you wind up being locked up, or you go to jail, or you get in any kind of trouble, you're afforded a lawyer, and you're able to then go before the courts and be tried before a jury of your peers? Do you realize today that we have a Marine that is locked up in Mexico? A former Marine locked up in Mexico. Have any of you read that? If you have, let me see. And yet all he did was make a wrong turn that anybody would have made that was down there. And here he is locked up today, and he will not have a court of his peers, but he goes before a judge, and the judge then makes that determination about whether they turn him loose or they set him free or what. Totally different in America. Well, people had to pay that price, and greatly that price was paid, really, by the greatest generation, World War II. When we went to war in Korea, when we went to war in Vietnam, the deal that we're in today in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth, those really haven't been a war. They've just been police actions, they say. Just a police action, if you can believe it, because America hasn't gone to war. During World War II, everybody went to war. There was a slogan called Rosie the Riveter. And all the young ladies and so forth went to work in the factories, and they touted that big time, Rosie the Riveter. There she was, and all the ladies turned out and were working in the factories. You couldn't buy anything hardly to get butter or to get gasoline or hose. Women couldn't get hose. They used pancake makeup on their legs with a little strip down the back. Can you believe that? It's just unbelievable. But everybody fought World War II. They all turned out. What do you know about Korea? What do you know about Vietnam? What do you know about the two things that are going on right now? Do you really know anything? Heck no, we don't, and I don't know too much either. And the reason I don't is because we just see it on television, don't we? And not a one of us have given up anything, have we? Not anything, but during World War II, everybody gave up something for the war and for the war effort. For us today to be free, for every one of you and me today to sit right here in this class, free, going about our daily lives, how wonderful that really is. Somebody had to pay the price. I had to pay a price, very small price, but a very large price. I served in submarines for 25 years and in diving for 25 years. And during that period of time, we had 52 submarines lost during World War II. We lost 1/3 of all of our submarines in World War II. We lost 35 with all hands aboard. We had 17 that was lost that had survivors. Out of that 17 that had survivors, only 7 submarines had survivors that went into Japanese prison camp. One of those submarines that went into prison camp, the Robalo, they only had 6 men get off of that ship, and they swam ashore. And as they swam ashore, the commanding officer and one other were shot on the spot. The other 4 was put in a little compound for about 4 days, loaded on a ship. We haven't seen them since. Can you believe it? Unbelievable. So that means that we really had survivors that were actually in prison camp off of 6 submarines. 2 of those submarines was on the surface and shot torpedoes at the enemy, and the torpedoes came back around and sank them. Can you believe it? Like the Tang, and just a few men got off the Tang, and we had the Sculpin, And let me tell you something about the sculpin that is unbelievable. The sculpin got hit, and they couldn't dive, and they couldn't make that submarine watertight. And so about 42 men abandoned ship and got off of that submarine. And a division commander was riding that boat because that boat was in kind of what they call a wolf pack, 2 or 3 submarines running together. And John Cromwell, who was a division commander riding, which they hardly ever did, when that boat got hit and they couldn't dive it again because they couldn't make it watertight and they were going to have to scuttle it, he said to the commanding officer of that vessel, I can't get into water and I can't become a prisoner of war. And everybody else abandoned ship. They sunk that ship. And they say that the last thing they saw was that division commander sitting in the wardroom drinking a cup of coffee as that submarine went under the water. That man was awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary bravery because he thought that if he was taken a prisoner of war, he might accidentally give some sort of information under tremendous duress that the enemy could use against us. How many of us today could do that? It'd be tough, wouldn't it? As your submarine sunk and the water was coming up around you, and you just sitting calmly having a cup of coffee, saying, I give my all. On my particular submarine, and any of you can pull it up if you like on Google, the USS Grenadier, or if you'd like, you can pull me up and you can see all kinds of things, called Charles H. Tim McCoy, and hit it, and you can run down through a great history of my time in the service and as a prisoner of war. I was on the Grenadier, and on April the 21st, 71 years ago, we were making a war patrol run from Singapore all the way up to Rangoon when we saw a Japanese vessel. We run alongside that vessel all night long, and we wasn't able to get in close enough to line up and to fire on that ship. So when sunrise came, we dove. When nighttime, sunrise came, we dove, and we ran, and finally our commanding officer said, I believe that we can get up on the surface and we can run in the daytime because we haven't seen any enemy aircraft, and I believe we can get ahead of that ship and line up so that we can fire on that ship. That's what we did. We came to the surface, and in 15 minutes we spotted a plane. And that plane started in on us, and we crash dived, and our bow was probably at 80 or 90 feet under the surface, and our stern 10 or 15 feet under the surface. The Japanese came right in on our wake, the plane, dropped a bomb that lit between our maneuvering room and our after torpedo room, and just blew us really to pieces. Water started pouring in because it lifted the watertight hatches. It lifted them off of their seats, and water sprayed in like he was in a shower. It split a soft patch, which y'all don't understand, but that was over the maneuvering room. And on those submarines in those days, in the maneuvering room, that's where all the electricity of that submarine was controlled, in that they controlled the screws and all the electricity and everything that happened throughout that submarine. In those days, they weren't nuclear powered. In those days, it was diesel electric for some of you guys that are mechanically inclined. The diesel engines produced the electricity and sent it to the main motors, and from the main motors to a reduction gear, and the reduction gear then turned the screws. So when we got hit, we were just helpless, and would you believe, just 267 feet, that's how deep the water was. Oh, what a blessing, because if it had been much deeper, I wouldn't be here today. But 267 feet, and we hit on the bottom, with water in 2 rooms flooded out. I'm in one of those rooms. And then finally, water got into the batteries, and when you get water into battery acid, with battery acid, you have chlorine gas. And when you have chlorine gas, you start bleeding at the mouth, the eyes, the ears, and the whole bit. And so what we did was we dogged off a hatch in the forward torpedo room. We bled in oxygen. We had oxygen bottles in the forward torpedo room. And we drugged people that were sick and couldn't do anything into the forward torpedo room. And we went to work on that submarine to see what we could do. And the only thing we could do was to get one pump in operation, and we got that pump in operation and pumped those 2 rooms down with the water in them to the extent that we could bring that submarine to the surface. Now this happened at about 8:15 in the morning, and we didn't come to the surface till 9 o'clock that night. And at 9 o'clock that night, we came to the surface, and then we started trying to work on that submarine to see what had gone wrong and what we could do. No radio. Couldn't get any messages out whatsoever. In addition to that, we run a direct lead from the batteries down there to those reduction gears, bypassing everything else, to see if we could get a screw to turn over. We got one screw to turn over 10 times, and it froze in its bearings. The other one wouldn't even turn. They said, well, let's see what's going on there. We had a little diving outfit aboard. I jumped in there and jumped over the side to take a look at what had happened to that submarine. And when that bomb hit, it knocked the stern of the ship up on an angle like this, and consequently you had those screw shafts setting in to those reduction gears on an angle, and actually they were frozen and wouldn't turn. So here we are, helpless, out in the middle of the ocean. When sunrise came, we saw a destroyer coming toward us. We also saw another airplane coming toward us. The airplane came, dropped a bomb, missed us. We got a gun in action, shot that pilot, but he was able to land that plane in Penang, a little island off the Malay Peninsula today, a beautiful spot as a matter of fact. And the ship then started bearing down on us. The commanding officer called us to quarters and said, gentlemen, would you like to take this submarine back down? We said, no, not under any circumstances. You can't make the ship watertight. All of the hatches were off of their seats and so forth. You couldn't dog them back down. If we'd have went back down, we'd have been going to our death. So he said, then we'll have to abandon ship. So that is exactly what we did. We pulled the vents on that submarine to sink it right in its spot, and we jumped in the water. And about 6 hours later, they picked us up out of the water. Now, friend, let me tell you something. Being in that big ocean out there, and to see your home just disappear, and you're out in the middle of the ocean, is an uncanny feeling. Bad-o. I'm telling you, baby, it's bad-o. You agree with me, don't you? I'm telling you, it is to see your home totally disappear, 6 hours in the water, and of course you're really nervous at this point because you're very sure that that destroyer coming in on you, that Japanese destroyer, they're going to machine gun every one of us that's in that water because they had done it before to another boat. They had machine gunned them, and consequently that's what we thought they were going to do. They didn't. They dropped down a cargo net after about 6 hours because they were mainly interested in spotting that submarine and where it went down, and they dropped a buoy there. I wondered if they were going to send divers down or what they were going to do, because we destroyed most everything in that submarine of any consequence. Records, torpedo data computers, crashed them, and that sort of thing before we abandoned ship. So there wasn't much information that they could get from that. And we climbed up a cargo net and set out on the deck. Young boy, 17 years of age at that time, 71 years ago. Unbelievable, isn't it? Unbelievable. But yet, in some ways today, it seems just like yesterday when you recall the events that happened. We were set out on that deck on that destroyer. And in those days, the commanding officer smoked, and they had what they called C-store cigarettes, that 50 cigarettes were in a tin with a top on them, and they were watertight. So when he got ready to abandon ship, he opened up a can of those C-store cigarettes, took some out, dropped his lighter in, put the top on, and put it in his pocket. Now, many of y'all, or some of you, wouldn't know this because I doubt that anybody here smokes, do you? But now, if you do, let me tell you this about smoking. People do it unconsciously. If you have a Coca-Cola, you want a cigarette. If you eat, you want a cigarette. If you get in the car to drive somewhere, you want a cigarette, you know? It's just that way. I don't understand it, but it is. So when we got all set and the guards all posted, just automatically he reached in, pulled out that tin, reached in, got his lighter, started to light a cigarette, and the guard hit him in the back and knocked him across the deck. And right then and there, I realized, as a young man in war, that this was not going to be a party. That this was not going to be any fun. They took us in to Penang, which is a little island off the Malay Peninsula. And they put us in the Catholic Convent. You can pull that up on the internet, no problem at all. And that was an all-girls finishing school back in those days. Just like we had at Vassar here in the United States, all the wealthy Malaysians sent their daughters to the Catholic Convent. It was a finishing school, and it was run by the Catholic sisters. And in fact, most of the schools back then were run by the Catholic sisters throughout all of Malaysia. But they overrun this school, closed the school down, but allowed the Catholic sisters to stay in their apartments during the war, but closed the school down, and they put us then in 2 of the rooms of that schoolhouse, and then they started their tortures. The first 7 days that we were captured, we stood at attention 24 hours a day. When you got so tired that you couldn't stand and just fell out, the person next to you had to pick you up and you slept on their shoulder. And when he couldn't hold you any longer, he slept on your shoulder. They give us 1 spoonful of water a day for 7 days and not 1 bit of food whatsoever. And at the end of that 7 days, then they started their tortures. The tortures revolved around going over to the headmaster's house and driving bamboo splinters under your fingernails, or putting dialing between your fingers and put them into a vice and crushing them. I guess you know that where your toes are concerned and where your fingers are concerned, that most of the nerves of your body run through your fingers and your toes, don't you? Have any of you ever hit your thumb? Ooh, do it hurt? Or your toe? Well, can you imagine that extensive pain taking place? In addition to that, we were in a land where there were coconuts. So they would put us down like this with a 2x4 planed on a razor edge underneath us like this, holding out 2 coconuts. Now you can't hold your own arms out for 15 minutes without them sagging, but as those arms started to sagging, then they beat you up and down the spine for 10 minutes or 20 minutes during that period of time. We also, people talk about, and y'all have heard just a little bit about it, but the older people have heard a lot more about it. It's called the water cure. Have you ever heard of the water cure? Everybody in the United States, you know, has been real upset about the water cure because the water cure has taken place in the United States where? You're absolutely right, boy. We got a sharp mind. Get low. The water cure, and everybody went up into arms. But we didn't invent the water cure. I believe the Japanese did, because that's what they did to our crew and others that they captured. They had no love for the submarine force, and they had no love for the Air Force. And friend, let me tell you this. I can tell you some harrowing stories about that, of just lining up aviators that were captured, and them digging their own graves and just taking a sword and cutting 6 men's head off instantly. Unbelievable. So the point of the matter is, when you think about something like that, it's truly, truly unbelievable, isn't it? It's truly unbelievable. Now, what were they looking for? They wanted to know what the name of our submarine was. Where were we working from? Were we working out of Pearl Harbor? Were we working out of Perth, Australia? How many submarines was in our squadron? How fast does your submarine dive? Where does it go and how deep does it go to avoid depth charge attack? What happens? What's the make and mod of your torpedoes? Do you have radar yet? Do you have sonar yet? And that's the information that they were driving for and what they wanted. I want to say to you that I am proud of my submarine crew and each one of us, that through all the torture that took place for 4 long straight months, 24 hours a day, that not one man in our crew broke or gave aid to the enemy. Now let me tell you something about Korea. Do you realize that in Korea, about half of the prisoners of war gave aid and comfort to the enemy? Do you realize that in Vietnam, that every POW in Vietnam gave aid or comfort to the enemy? And as we said here today, John McCain, and all of you are familiar with John McCain, right? Great POW. That's one of the great heartaches in his life, that they were able to break him and cause him to give aid and information to the enemy. But you've got to take this in its proper place. As I started out and told you, in World War II, we were fighting a war to win all war, and the whole nation was involved. It wasn't just a little police action here, and a police action there, and another police action here, and one over there. So the guys that wound up being POWs in that era, and nobody behind them, and the country is not behind them, and etc., it was pretty easy to break under those circumstances. And then in addition to that, I believe everybody has a breaking point maybe in their lives. Somewhere, someplace, maybe a breaking point. I don't know, because some people can stand physical pain and others can't stand physical pain. So anyway, at the end of 4 months in Penang, they load us aboard ship and send us down to Singapore. And we're down to Singapore at Changi, the largest prisoner of war camp that there was during World War II. You recall the bridge over the River Kwai? That was a big movie that was made. Most of that is kind of fictitious because that big fancy bridge wasn't there. It was only there in the eyes of the movie production company. But we were down there, but they didn't put us in the general population. They kept our crew separated from those at Changi. We were there for about 5 or 6 weeks, and they loaded us aboard the Osama Maru, which was a luxury liner that ran from Tokyo to San Francisco before the war. Luxury liner. And they loaded us aboard that luxury liner. But I did not have any food, nor did I have a nice cabin, nor did any waiters come by to call on me and ask me what I wanted. As a matter of fact, they had me in a hole in the bottom of that ship, our entire crew. Unbelievable. And of course, when we left, we were in a convoy, and we zigzagged all the way from Singapore to Shimonoseki in Japan. And would you believe that several ships were shot out of that convoy, and wonder that our ship hadn't been shot also. 3 days before we got to Japan, in the bottom of that hole, as you know on ships, there's ship's railings, about this big around, that runs around everywhere, you know, that you can hold on to when that ship is rocking and rolling. And so we're in that hole, and there was about 7 of the sailors aboard that Osama Maru that dropped down in that hole. They lined every one of us up like this, holding that railing, and they broke off a long piece of that railing. and they decided that they would work us over. And they beat us for 3 days before that ship got in, and on at least 4 of our crew that took that beating, they got hit in the spine. Never was right from that point on. Never was right after that point on. When we got to Japan and Shimonoseki, we were there just for about 2 weeks, and they finally sent us over to Kyushu, and that's where we went to work at Seitetsu, which is Mitsubishi, which builds the automobiles, but then it was about the second largest factory in the entire world, and we worked about 14 hours or so every day on such meager rations that it was unbelievable, because not anybody in my prison camp weighed much over 100 pounds, and yet we were working 14 hours a day. Now, the one thing about being in prison camp, we didn't get beatings every day there, and we worked every day and worked in that huge factory every day. But the bad thing was, and it's unbelievable, is living with bed bugs and living with lice. You'll never believe this, but in the summer months, in those barracks throughout all the prison camps in Japan, bed bugs fell by absolutely the millions and billions, from the rafters, from the ceiling, everything. Just unbelievable. Y'all probably have never seen a bed bug, have you? But you have heard of lice, haven't you? Because they talk about it a little bit at school, with somebody maybe getting lice in their hair. But they're little pesky devils about that big. And in prison camp, they were there by the millions. I've seen people take off what little jacket they had in the winter months and lay it outside, and maybe a little bit of the sun hit it, and it just looked like a huge bed of worms working. It was truly unbelievable. You know, it's kind of like Louis Timberlake, our great, wonderful Sunday school teacher and motivator, who every once in a while made reference to Corrie ten Boom. And Corrie ten Boom was a tremendous missionary and was a prisoner of war herself in Japan. And they went into her barracks one day, and they pulled her out, and they stripped her off naked and stood her out there before the whole world. But that didn't stop her from teaching the Bible. And so after the war was over, and she was in Germany giving a presentation, when that presentation was over, a man got up and walked over to her and said, "Corrie ten Boom, do you remember me?" She said, "No, I really don't." He said, "I was one of the guards at your prison camp." Said, "Do you know why we didn't come into your barracks and harass you any longer the last year that you were there?" She said, "No, I never did understand that." He said, "We hated fleas worse than we did the Bible." Unbelievable, isn't it? Absolutely unbelievable. So this little presentation that I've given you here today, what does that really mean to you? And is there some important thought that you can take with you this morning as you face life, many of you getting ready to go to college and so forth? I would recommend to you that you take Jesus with you, if at all possible. The time is going to come in each one of your lives that mother and daddy can't help you, that your best friend can't help you, that nobody can help you. When that time comes, what will you do? In my particular case, I was a Christian because I accepted Christ as my Savior when I was 9 years old in First Baptist Church, Lubbock, Texas. So I had somebody with me throughout that entire ordeal. And as a matter of fact, he's kept me very close. And I'm the only member of my submarine crew that is alive today. And I'll tell you in finishing up, my best friend that slept alongside of me in prison camp was George Snyder. You can see that on the internet. And as he slept alongside of me one night, he woke up at about midnight, and he said, "Have you ever tasted anything so delicious as hotcakes, sausage, and eggs just melting in butter. Well, he had just tripped out. And we had to take him over to a small dispensary that we had in prison camp. And there he was. The Japanese gave us a day off every 3 months to try to take a bath, to try to clean up, and this sort of thing. And this was the day that we had off. We spent the entire morning saluting out on a tarmac. The sergeant major of that camp kind of went like this. You know, the Japanese, they don't do too much of that. They do the kiri, nore. And we spend all morning long with the sergeant major out there in front of us. Mark, Matt, kiri, nore. Well, that afternoon, several of us were standing around, and it seemed like that's just kind of a blanket thrown over me. And something said, your buddy's dying. I raced from there over to that little makeshift dispensary. And sure enough, George Snyder was not in this world, and he wasn't in the other world yet. Suspended, so to speak. And I raced in there and said, George, George, George. And a big smile came on his face. And he said, Father, I see thy face, and slipped out of this world. I ask you, what did he see? As life comes and goes with each other, each one of you, take Jesus with you. Thanks for allowing me to be here.